Let's begin with the SLRC general introduction. What is SLRC research?
SLRC is a consortium of researchers and we're working together in partnership. We work in three countries mainly in Africa, so in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, in South Sudan and in northern Uganda. And we also work a little bit in Sierra Leone. But in Asia, we're working in Nepal, of course, in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And our key objective in the SLRC is try to better understand livelihoods, basic services like health and education, and also social protection. And we're trying to understand them in conflict or post-conflict countries.
SLRC has recently carried out a research on livelihood, basic services, social protection and public perception on service provider in relation to post-conflict state building in Nepal. What is the reason behind this research in Nepal?
What we're trying to do with the research that we're doing at the moment in Nepal is get a better understanding of how state building happens after a conflict. So how is it that a state becomes more legitimate in the eyes of its people, and how is it that we can build the capacity of the state to deliver things like health and education services or water or livelihood support? And we've been doing that by carrying out a series of surveys, mainly in Ilam, Bardiya and Rolpa, but also doing some other work looking at how taxation affects people's livelihoods or how migration affects their livelihoods. And I guess, I don't know, do you want to hear some really interesting things that we've been finding from our survey?
Yeah, well, what are the key findings? Could you please share these key findings with us?
Yeah, I mean there's probably 4 things that I think are really important. The first one is when you read the media in Nepal, quite often you hear people say the state doesn't deliver anything. There's no health services, there's no education services. And our evidence contradicted that really. We found that people were receiving services, but also that they were really quite satisfied with some of the services that they received. So for example, when we asked people lots of questions about their health post, their local health post, we found that 65% of respondents were either fairly satisfied or very satisfied with the services they received there. And to be honest, that surprised us. We were expecting people to be much more negative. We did find that people in urban areas were much less satisfied than people in rural areas. And we think that's because in urban areas there's so much more choice. There's availability of services from NGOs and from the private sector. And so that made people a little bit more negative about the government.
Okay, in your experience, how does conflict affect the service of people, and how long time and how much resources is required to recover that damages due to the conflict? What is the cost of recovering the
cost?
Conflict?
Goodness
Yeah.
me. I guess there are 2 things that are important to say here. One is that we know that whilst conflict affects service delivery in all sorts of ways, it reduces the capacity of the government to deliver services. It means that for example, health workers or teachers find it difficult to deliver well on their jobs in schools and in health posts and so on. They might be intimidated by people who are perpetrating violence and so on. But whilst we know that that happens, we also found something very, very important in Nepal, and that was that conflict is not necessarily the most important thing affecting people's lives. And we realised that all the time in our research, we always explained everything through conflict. And what people told us in Nepal was that the biggest shocks or difficulties that they face relate to things like natural disasters.
Yes, you have selected 3 sample districts, that is Ilam, Bardiya and Rolpa.
That's
yes.
right.
Can we nationalize these findings? Can we contextualize that finding in national level?
We can't say that our results are absolutely representative of Nepal as a whole, but we can say that when we get down to the village level, we can be representative. So at the village VDC level, we're representative in the survey.
How did you carry out this research? Did you make association with local research agency, or SLRC carried out this research alone?
SLRC can't carry out research alone. It's a consortium which is led by the Overseas Development Institute in London, but has a series of partners all over the world. And in Nepal, our partner was NCCR, the Nepal Centre for Contemporary Research.
NCCR.
That's right.
Okay.
And so basically we work in partnership with NCCR on everything that we do that relates to the research in Nepal. And it was NCCR that we worked together with to design the survey, and it was NCCR who used their staff to go out into the field and interview people in all of the 3 districts where we worked. And we had a big team of more than 20 enumerators collecting evidence and doing interviews in each of the 3 districts.
Is it a quantitative research or qualitative or mixed?
It's a combination of both, and what we've tried to do through the process is do some qualitative research that then informs what we do in the quantitative research, and then we get all these new questions that come from the quantitative research from our survey, and we're now at the stage of going back and trying to use qualitative methods to dig in a little bit more to what we found in the survey.
SLRC has experience working with other countries in addition to Nepal for the similar task here. You are working in Africa,
That's right.
other South Asian countries and Nepal. In your experience, what are the similarities in these countries based on the findings of your research, especially referring to the post-conflict state building situation and research findings?
There are some similarities and some differences. So, for example, whilst what we see in Nepal I would describe as a state building objective, in Sri Lanka I think it's a little bit different. I think it's a nation building objective. I think there's a strong national identity amongst people in Nepal, whereas in Sri Lanka I think people feel much more divided in terms of language and so on. So that's one of the differences. But I think one of the big similarities between all the countries is that when you ask people what they think about their governments, whether it reflects their needs, whether it listens to them, whether it does what they need, one of the things that we found across lots of the countries was that people say quite positive things about their local government. They feel that they have access to it, they feel that they're relatively close to it, and it's listening to them.
Nepali people?
Nepali people and Sri Lankan people
Sri Lankan
and people in Pakistan also. And we're trying to unpick and understand why there is that difference now between how people feel or their perceptions of local government and how they feel about central government. And in Nepal in particular, people felt very distant from the government at a central level.
If so, what is the key message of SLRC research findings, not only in Nepal, but also in other South Asian countries and African countries as well?
We found that people have better access to services, to health and to education and to water than we thought. And we found that people have really quite negative perceptions of central governments. And what we're trying to understand is how that's going to change over time. And we've not figured it out yet, and we'll be going back to interview people again in 2015, the very, very same people in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan. And we're going to try and understand a bit better how long the process takes for people's perceptions to change. Because people need to see their government as legitimate, otherwise it will be very, very difficult for us to have state building and peace building taking place.
I'll again like to talk about Nepal based on the SLRC research findings. Yes, you have carried out this very interesting research. And what would be the further action?
I mean, we're still in the very early stages of the research that we're doing. So we're 2.5 years into the process, and it's going to be a 6-year research project. And so in a way, we expect to have some really big messages to tell people about what we're finding a bit later on in the process. But what we really want to avoid doing is producing lots of books at the end of the process and not telling people about what we're doing along the way. So we're constantly offering to give seminars or to present our findings at workshops and conferences. And we'd love to spend more time talking to people in government in Nepal about what we're finding. And we're also trying to do things like talk to you, Prakash, so that other people in Nepal can watch the TV and learn a little bit about what we're doing. And most importantly, learn about the findings and perhaps think about what that means for them in their jobs.
Rachel, what is the relationship between research, policy and practice in post-conflict state building?
At the moment, there's a very weak relationship, to be honest. So if we look at things like the way that the United Nations, the OECD, which is a group of relatively rich countries that invest in development in places like Nepal, at the moment they base some of their policies and some of their programming on ideas that have not been proven in practice. And so what we're trying to do is use research to prove them. A really good example of this is that the OECD countries invest enormous amounts of funding in delivering basic services with the very specific objective of contributing towards state building. And in 2009, they spent more than $46 billion in conflict-affected countries trying to achieve state building by delivering services. But we don't have evidence yet that that works. So what we're trying to do is use our research project to try and understand that pathway by which we deliver services, we change the way that people feel about the state, and we perhaps make them less likely to resort to future violence in order to try and get the state to deliver what they want. And so there's this idea that we're testing that we contribute to peace building by delivering services.
If so, how can we means developing countries or post-conflict countries improve their policies by promoting the research? Do you think we have to increase the investment research fund, or we have to produce the researcher, or we have to enable our research institute? Or what can we do?
I think there's a really big challenge here. I mean, there's certainly a case to be made for governments or research councils in places like Nepal to invest more in research, and to invest in research in universities, in research institutes, in very independent think tanks. And there's no question for me that that should be part of how research moves forward in Nepal. But there's also a challenge, and Nepal has a relatively small research community, and the challenge is that for it to produce good research, it needs to be utterly independent. And if it gets most of its money from the government, it's very difficult for it to be independent. In the UK, at ODI, at the Overseas Development Institute where I work, we get about half of our funding from the British government, but we get the other half from the United Nations, from the Irish government, the government of the European Union, from the Australian government, from all sorts of places. So it's much easier for us to maintain that level of independence, and I think getting that balance right will be important. So yes, government in Nepal should be funding high quality research by local research organisations, but I think we also need to help them find research funding from outside, so that they can maintain that independence.
That is the existing situation. Here I would like to again ask you that how can we improve that situation? How can we improve promote the research-based policy development culture?
I think there are a few things that we can do, and one of them is to do something called impact mapping. So we look at how research has resulted in a change of policy or an improvement in the way that a program or a project has been operating. And I think when people in government are able to see more the benefits of research and the benefits of evidence, because it helps them be more efficient and more effective at delivering in their jobs, that then we might see more interest in supporting research and local research organisations in Nepal. But I also think that organisations like mine have a job to do to help generate funding for Nepali research organisations from outside, and we're quite well placed to do that, and we're trying to support NCCR at the moment in doing that, and also other organisations in Nepal that we work with, so Nepal, the Nepal Participatory Research Network. We're also working with them. And I think we also need to take responsibility for helping build capacity to generate funding.
You have a long experience, intensive experience of research. We just talk about the trend of research trend in Nepal. What is the trend of research in other countries? Not only the case of post-conflict countries, but other developing countries. It's similar case or different?
I think it's quite similar. I mean, I think there are certain questions about the capacity that exists within Nepal, and certainly there's progress to be made there. So there are all sorts of ways in which we can help strengthen research capacity here. And that might be through doing certain kinds of training courses. It might be by doing things like doing swaps of staff. So earlier, last year, one of NCCR's staff member came and sat in London and worked with us in ODI for 3 months and learnt about how we operate and how we do research. And then next year, we're hoping that from around February, a member of my team in London will come and sit with NCCR for a number of months. And so we learn from doing and working together rather than always doing very formal training courses.
Your emphasis in capacity building, institutional capacity building or professional capacity building or government capacity building or all?
All of them. I mean, I think in relation to research, it's not just about individuals being able to deliver better research. It's about giving organisations the capacity at an institutional level to function very effectively. So one of the things that we've found working with NCCR is helping them to align their systems so that they better understand what some of our major donors want and how we need to report to them has been a really important thing. But I think we also need to build the capacity of people in government to use research.
In this context, what is the role of academic institutions like universities and research institute to promote the research culture?
I think it's critical, and I was thinking this morning about how important it is to invest in young people and their capacity to do research. And that's partly because, I think young people are much more open to new ideas. They don't carry baggage around them in relation to all of the things that they've tried before or the ways that they're used to working. But I think it's also really important for us to help equip them with those analytical skills that they need to understand the research that they read or to understand what other people are finding. And there's also a kind of final reason for doing it, which is lots of people in universities will move into jobs outside academic research institutes. They might move into jobs in government. They might be the very people that are going to be the users of our research in the future. So making sure that they have the skills to be able to read and understand the findings from research like the SLRC will be really important for their future jobs, for the efficiency or the effectiveness of policies and decisions in the government in the future. So it's a long-term investment for Nepal, really.
You have outlined some very important point of research which is directly connected to the speedy development and speedy transformation of the country. But how challenging is this task?
It's an enormous task, and when we talk about, for example, about capacity and how long it takes to start to build state capacity, it raises some really difficult questions about how much can we expect in a post-conflict situation. And I always find it slightly strange that in countries that for a long time have had high levels of poverty, low levels of economic development, like Nepal, that suddenly when we get post-conflict, we expect Nepal to be able to progress so much faster than it ever did before it had a conflict. So there's a challenge there around what expectations we should have. And I think one of the ways in which research is very important here is that it helps us to think through what our expectations might be and how fast we think that things might happen. And if you look at how long it might take to scale up health services in somewhere like Rolpa, do we really think that it's going to happen in 2 or 3 years? I don't think we can make those kinds of assumptions. It took a long time to build up health services even before conflict in Nepal. So of course it's going to be difficult and take time afterwards. And I do think that some of the findings from our research will help us get a message over, in particular to donor agencies, to the United Nations, to the World Bank and so on, that they need to be a little bit more patient and not get frustrated when things don't automatically return to a brilliant scenario very quickly after conflict. It will take time.
Yes, we talked about some challenges of research here in Nepal. Can we say there are some opportunities in the field of research as well?
I think so. I mean, one of my favourite stories that I like to tell about the SLRC survey that we did was that because we were very worried about how we were going to find people again in 3 years' time when we come back to find the same people, to ask them the same questions again, we used GPS coordinates.
GPS?
Yeah, and we recorded the coordinates of every single interview that we did. And one of the strange things that we think has happened as a result that we did not expect is that it was very, very difficult for anybody to cheat and to pretend that they had done an interview that they had not done. And we know that that's one of the big risks doing research, that you have somebody who goes and sits under a tree and they fill in the form, but they haven't talked to somebody. But because we recorded the GPS coordinates, we could tell whether the interviews had taken place or not. So it's strange, but some of the difficulties associated with doing the research and the ways that we've tried to manage them have actually created an opportunity for us to make sure that what we do is much higher quality than it might have been.
And my last question would be, how research promote the speedy development, social economic transformation, and other national progress in the line of development in your experience? How do you share your experience in this line?
That already governments and donor agencies are stopping and starting to try and think through delivering services and why they do it. And one of the positive things that we're starting to see is that we think that not placing so much emphasis on state building when we're talking about delivering basic services is important. Delivering basic services is important whether or not it contributes to state building or peace building. It's important for people to have access to basic services. It's important for kids to be able to go to school, even if it doesn't affect peace building or state building. It's important in its own right. And those sorts of messages, we think, are helping us to start to change people's attitudes towards delivering basic services so that they don't hang everything on the state building and peace building objective.
Thank you, Dr. Ryalchal, very much for your this time and valuable information.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure.